Now, I know that permissions can be a very big topic, but if this is properly explained and I do my job carefully, you will understand how this works and you will be confident doing it when you begin to work with SharePoint. We just have to kind of settle in for a little bit and understand some basic concepts. When you first hear how permissions work, your background determines how you're going to understand all of this. When I first got into working with these permissions, now I'm going to go back before the year 2007, because the product had a different name before it was called SharePoint. I remember working on a project here, and I was kind of roundly rebuked by a Microsoft engineer who was helping me to resolve a problem at a customer site. And it was because I was doing all these things. It ought to have worked the way I was doing it, but really my thought process was incorrect. I had not adopted to really the SharePoint universe yet. I was trying to treat everything out here the way I would as a network administrator. As network administrators, we put all these resources out on the network, and we deny access to everybody until they beg and they yell and they scream loudly enough, and then we give them access to a file, a folder, an application, or a printer, or something else. Well, SharePoint, the paradigm is completely different. And as this this network engineer kind of rebuked me, and he said, Eric, listen, we call the product SharePoint, not HidePoint. Like stop doing what you're doing. The goal is to make information easily available, easily discoverable, not to see if you can keep so many people away from it. You have to change how you're thinking about permissions. And it was a well-deserved rebuke, and I did learn that lesson, and I was thinking a bit like a network administrator. So I say that because when you first begin to look at these things, you sometimes feel like someone's trying to sell you, a left-handed garden hose or something. Like, what? Why are you doing it like this? Just remember, the idea is to make information available, and then the exception is to remove permissions when you don't want somebody to access something. So, first, everything in SharePoint can be secured. They're all called securable objects. This is lists, library sites, individual files, individual items in a list, etc. By default, they will inherit permissions from the site itself. Now, we can break that and we can create unique permissions on lists, libraries, and folders. If we're going to do folders, that's allowable, and sometimes that's very necessary. Also, we're going to need how to manage something that we call group membership. And here's the idea behind group membership. With group membership, we put people into and remove them from certain groups. And I'm going to show you exactly how that works. If I have only 2,000 documents in one site across a few libraries and 500 users of my site, imagine what would happen if I had to spend all day adding and removing permissions on a person-by-person basis. You can get to this, you can't get to that, you can get to this, you can't get to that. This is what I would do all day. I wouldn't get any productive work done. So what we do is we put permissions on groups. And you only need about 6 or 7 groups. The software only comes with 3 or 4. Sure, you could create your own. But the idea is I make people members of groups. I will have owners, I will have contributors, and I will have members. And you'll see this in a moment. And then I will simply remove people from the groups, or I'll add them to the groups. And is that going to incredibly simplify my life? So there's a concept for us to keep in the back of our minds now. Very often, granting and removing access is nothing more than taking somebody out of a group or putting a new person into a group. The group itself will manage the permissions. Okay, so I realize that from one organization to the next, sometimes different individuals will do this. Sometimes IT wants to have all of that control and they take it away even from site owners. My experience has also been they get sick and tired of doing it and they say, we're going to give this back to the site owners. To which I say, that's what you should have been doing. And then train them on how to do this properly. And presumably that's why you're all here. Now, before we go any further, a couple of best practices. For any site, it's ideal to have 2 or 3 individuals who can function as owners. The reason is that you don't want all that administrative burden on one person. And what happens if that one person falls ill for a while and takes a sick leave? Okay, now who's going to do ownership of all of this, right? What happens if you win the lotto tonight and all of a sudden you retire early? Who's going to manage those sites and so on? So the best practice is really to have 2 or 3 owners per site with everybody trained to the same level. You may delegate responsibilities any way you like, but we typically like several people there. All right, and then secondly, we are going to continue to emphasize the idea that you place your permissions on groups, not individuals. Some organizations have thousands and thousands of employees. Can you imagine if we had to manage permissions on every last document or list or library in all these SharePoint sites? It would be overwhelming. I'm not exaggerating to make a point. I have been to some of our customers, literally over 7,000 or 10,000 sites in an organization, and some of these are multinational organizations. Okay? So this becomes hugely problematic without well-trained site owners who understand that you put the permissions on the groups and then you take people in and out of groups. All right, now one more. This concept of avoid creating unique permissions at the item level. What does the item level mean? It could mean a row in a list. It could also mean one individual document in a library. Now you can do it. You can secure items all the way down to the file level, if that's truly what you want to do, or the page level. But if you do that, you're creating an administrative burden that you may not like. And so we generally recommend you avoid doing that. There are certainly times where if I have a handful of files that just, maybe 3 people in the company ought to see, I almost always create a subsite for those individuals and I handle it that way. And I put those files into a library in a subsite and say, here, you 3 or 4 people are the only ones who ever get into this subsite. That actually saves you an incredibly large amount of work. Now, I know IT doesn't like the proliferation of these sites, but they also understand the reason for it. So it's not unwarranted. It's actually quite common to have a lot of subsites with only 7 or 8 people that have access specifically for this reason. All right, so let's take a look at permission levels. So what are these? Right out of the box with SharePoint, you get 4. You can create as many levels as you like, but you get 4. The first one is called read permission, and it's just what it says here on my screen. You can read content and you can download items. We can even restrict the ability to download, but the reason that they've set it this way is because if something cannot be displayed for whatever reason in the browser, you're going to need to download it in order to read it. So a good example might be, for example, I've been to places where, for whatever reason, their installation of SharePoint, you can click onto a Visio file, Microsoft Visio, but you can't see it. You can click on a Microsoft project file, but you can't see it. You have to download it in order to see anything. Because for whatever reason, they don't have the server-side readers in place, and it gets to be a very IT kind of a function, but you need to download it to see it. And so the very basic level is read. Okay, now contribute. This is where most people will live. Not you as a site owner, you need a level higher. But most people will be contributors. They can read, download, they can edit, they can delete, they can create. That is, to my mind, the best collaborative experience we're going to get. So for any one site, most people are going to have a contribute permission level. Right now, remember, we're going to assign this to the group. We just haven't done it yet. Most people will be contributors. A handful of us are owners, and then down there for read, I've been in many read groups over the years because I'm often an outside contractor, an outside vendor, an outside consultant, and they're not going to let me change stuff. I just need to be able to read it in order to assist them. Okay, now there is an edit group that comes out as well. And I said that there are 4 permission levels out of the box, and we're looking at 3 of them so far. Edit has everything that contribute has, and it has the ability to create and delete libraries and lists. You want to be careful before you give somebody this, because there are lots of people who simply create libraries because they don't know how to use the libraries they have. They don't know how to use metadata properly. And so what they end up doing is they end up creating the same mess they've already created on a shared network drive. Drive Q or drive P or drive J. They just create a library, throw files in it, build out all these folders, start throwing files into the folders, and that kind of a scheme probably makes sense to them, and it makes sense to nobody else, and nobody can find stuff. So I think that if you're going to be a good site owner, you really want control over the creation of libraries and lists. It's just an opinion based upon experience. If you want to let people loose to do this stuff, you go right ahead and do that. All right, now, owners. That's why you're here. That's us. So we can do everything that everybody else. We have read, we have contribute, we have edit, and we have several other things. We can create new sites. We can control permissions. That's the entire reason we have this chapter in our course. Design has to do with designing pages and different ways of doing things there. That's more of a creative side. It's a separate course. Strongly recommend it. But you do not need to be a designer. You don't have to understand design to be an awesome site owner. Right? This is what we're covering here. All right, now, is there anything else that we might need to know about? Oops, I'm going to back up a slide. My apologies, team. Is there anything else we might need to know about? Yes. There is a level lower than read. And you might be thinking, well, what's lower than read? All you can do is read and download stuff. There's actually one they call visitor, where all you can do is read and you can't even download or print, meaning you have to focus on the screen, consume the content, and that's all you'll be able to do. It's completely non-interactive. You can't even download. There is a more restrictive one out there, and we can grab that if we like. There is also a permission level higher than owner, right? There's something that actually exceeds owner. So you might be thinking like, wow, what's more powerful than an owner? Tom Brady? No, more powerful than Tom Brady. It's called a site collection administrator. So you control the top level site, the outermost perimeter, and because you control the top level site, you control all the subsites in there as well to a very large degree. Those subsites can become autonomous, but yeah, you're controlling the entire site collection. That, of course, is a completely different set of topics. Here we're focusing how to be a good site owner, an awesome site owner of just one or two sites. So understand that those exist. All right, now what's left? Just this. Like I said, those permission levels get assigned to groups, and it's this way out of the box. We just have to understand it. Read gets associated with visitor. Contribute or edit is associated with member. You decide as the site owner. And then, of course, everything that we could want to do as owners is applied to the owner group, right? Now, the permission levels have been assigned to the groups for us. We just decide what it is we'd like to do. Our work involves putting people into groups and removing them from groups. And that's it. Now, just before we walk away from this, one last thought. Site owners who are taking over sites that you've inherited from somebody else, one of your first jobs is to audit the security for that site. You don't have to change anything. Look inside the groups, see who's in them, and ask yourself the question, do I even know who half these people are? Should I move them into different groups? Should I take them out completely? Lots of times as people move through an organization, they go from one department to another division. They don't really need to be in these groups anymore, and you don't even recognize them. So I've always recommended the first thing you do is audit your security. Just make a list, put it in an Excel spreadsheet, who's in what, and kind of color code the people whose names you don't recognize. And then decide if you're going to leave them there or take them out. But at least record it so you can put them back in if you need to at a later point. Other than that, let's get started.